Welcome to Public Health on Call, a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, where we bring evidence, experience, and perspective to make sense of today's leading health challenges. If you have questions or ideas for us, please send an email to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes.
This is Lindsay Smith-Rogers. Today, Stephanie Desmon talks to Chas Eby, Deputy Executive Director of the Maryland Department of Emergency Management, about how states and communities can and will prepare for disasters arising from climate change. They discuss the concept of resilience and what that looks like as climate extremes and natural disasters rise. Let's listen.
Chas Eby, thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks for the invitation, Stephanie.
So today I want to talk to you about emergency management in the context of climate change. So your job in the past, there's a hurricane coming right away, everyone batten down the hatches, make sure people know if they should evacuate, if they should, what they should do to prepare. But with climate change emergencies, things look a little different.
They look very different. We've seen a significant change in the landscape of the disaster world. There's more extreme weather. These are the big ones. These are the things that everyone hears about on the news, the wildfires, extreme heat, the frequency of major hurricanes, including one that's affecting the United States right now down near Florida and Georgia. And that's true. Since 1980, there's been an average of about 8 incidents and disasters costing $1 billion. And in the last 5 years, there have been 18 events annually, and that's adjusted for inflation, and 15 in 2023 alone. It's only the end of August. So the disaster world's changing very much.
And so what are you doing to prepare that is different?
Well, in Maryland and in emergency management in general, we've taken a different approach to the discipline. It's really evolved. It's shifted from what was once primarily focused on civil defense 50 and 60 years ago to hazard-specific planning. So what are you at threat for? If you're a coastal state, it might be a hurricane or flooding, to an all hazards approach. And I'd actually argue that we're now beyond an all hazards approach. And now emergency management is looked to be the problem solvers and multi-agency, multidisciplinary coordinators for other large problems, including climate change.
So what does that look like?
In some cases, states have developed and stood up offices of resilience or state resiliency goals, the purpose of which is to address, climate change, as well as the adaptation that geographic area needs to take for climate change. But also, again, other problems that are interconnected and that affect all of us every day: public health issues, transportation issues, food resiliency issues, and food insecurity issues. All of these things, all these problems really build on each other, right? And studies have demonstrated that areas that have one or more of these issues are more negatively affected by disasters. It's exacerbated. Disasters exacerbate inequalities and risks that communities face every day. And so emergency management's beginning to evolve to be this coordinating entity that is really just focused on what's the biggest problem at the community level and how can we bring together our partners across all these disciplines to work more effectively and efficiently.
So how are we preparing for climate change in Maryland? Are we just waiting, or are there active things going on?
No, there are a number of activities that not only state agencies, but nonprofits, non-government organizations. We're fortunate in Maryland to have great academic institutions. And that's the thing. There's a number of great policies and programs going on. And in emergency management, in the Maryland Department of Emergency Management, we're standing up the state's first Office of Resilience. And again, I see that as a coordinating entity. We need to build upon the great work that's already going on and just make sure that we're achieving economies of scale so that they're not siloed into single discipline areas, but that they're working together. We can do this through a place-based approach. So rather through a discipline like environmental concerns or public health or transportation, look at the place. So what places are vulnerable to disasters and stressors every day? And how do we work together to bring all of those programs, policies, and grants together to focus on decreasing disaster risk and building up capabilities in those communities every day?
Can you share some examples?
I certainly can. Recently, we received a grant through FEMA's Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities program to do a project in Baltimore City. It's multi-sector and multi-levels of government. It's along the middle branch of the Chesapeake Bay. And what we're doing there is we're looking at that geographic area through multiple stakeholders' priorities and initiatives. That we're going to build a coordinated network of vegetated berms, like living shorelines, restoring wetlands and aquatic habitats, and enhancing the public spaces in that area, mainly in Baltimore City. There are major utility infrastructure and critical infrastructure in the area. So Baltimore Gas and Electric, which is a major utility in the area, has a site there that will reduce the risk to their incidents and flooding in that area. There's a hospital in South Baltimore in that area as well. And so this really brings to light a major tenet of resilience, that we're increasing the capabilities in that area by enhancing the critical infrastructure. So like a utility and a hospital. So that helps reduce risk for electrical outages, increases public health. But at the same time, we're increasing capability. We're also decreasing risk because these projects that will be implemented are green infrastructure. There's benefits directly related to adapting to climate change. We're including social spaces in these projects. So again, they're community spaces that are for the community. And while we build capability, we're also currently reducing disaster risk.
So we can't stop these events from happening, but we can improve our defenses.
Yeah, I think there are things we can do to mitigate disasters ahead of time, but I would agree. Resilience, Webster's would define it as the ability to withstand and recover from shocks and stressors. And that's true. And the definition can be useful. People define it very differently. To me, what's important is how do we identify which levers we can pull to become resilient? And that's at both the individual and the government level. So for an individual, how do we better understand our risks that affect us? All of us have a completely different risk profile. It's where you live, it's the family you have, it's underlying conditions you might have, it's all sorts of things. How do you understand your risk better? Decide what risks you, as an individual or family, are willing to accept and make that a conscious decision, right? Like public health has done a good job in this. So like seatbelts, that's a good example of something small, mundane in a way, but you're really making a conscious decision. And most people, I believe, are using seatbelts, but you can broaden that out to other things in your life. And then once you've identified your risks, understand that, decide what you're willing to accept, then you can take action to reduce the risks you have. And that's really important. At the government level, what we need to be focused on is first improving communication methods to people so that they can understand their risk. Like I do see that as an onus of responsibility on government. But then again, how do we build up community capabilities while at the same time bringing down the risk by making mitigating measures that can reduce the impacts after a disaster?
Maryland has a lot of coastline. Has there been talk that some of those places might have to be relocated? Is that sort of down the road, or are you starting to think about those things now?
One thing that's important for me at the state level of government is acknowledging that risks are best identified and even handled at the localmost level, at the community level. What we would like to do, what we are doing, is enabling those communities to make decisions like that by, first and foremost, again, providing access to information, technical assistance, and subject matter expertise, not just in emergency management, but with climate and environmental experts. And then ensuring that grant opportunities, both at the federal and state level, are open to those communities interested in that. We have seen communities plan for the effects of climate change, including doing mitigation measures through FEMA's Hazard Mitigation Assistance Program, but also other federal grants, and think about land use and development, which is really an underused tactic in resilience and in emergency management. Taking an idea from public health, I believe emergency management should be in all policies because of our leadership role in hazard mitigation and resilience in the state and across the nation. Master planning must incorporate future conditions and how that will affect disasters. Almost all infrastructure and major planning projects will either increase or decrease risk to disasters, not just the threat. We're very focused on the threat. But for communities, we can also reduce community vulnerability and community consequence, regardless of the threat. And that's an area that's ripe for development over the next few years and something that emergency management needs to focus on.
This conversation just made me think of Smith Island, which I don't know if most of our listeners know about Smith Island. It's a tiny island off the coast of Maryland in the Bay. They are vulnerable sitting out there far from the land. They're just a small island. People live there full year. What happens to a place like that?
Yeah, there will be tough decisions for some communities. Smith Island in particular, let's flip this on its head a little bit and talk about some really good things that they have in their corner regarding this. There's a high degree of social cohesion in that area, and also many areas that are experiencing the effects of climate change. That's really important. There are studies that demonstrate that social cohesion, not just social or monetary capital, is a high determinant of resiliency and recovery. I'll share a small story and we can build out from there. So I live in Baltimore City in a row house. That's a townhouse for other areas that aren't in Baltimore. We call them row houses. And there was a fire that affected the row of homes that I share an alley with on my street. And so these are people I know. They live right across the alley from me. It's devastating on an individual level. There were 10 houses destroyed or affected from that. So at 3 a.m., we get a knock on our door from a neighbor. They actually also had to call me. I have 1-month-old twins at the time and was sleeping. This was a rare moment of sleep. But they knock, they call me, we go outside. The response from the community, our micro community level, was so important. One of my neighbors took in a friend from whose house was affected for a few nights at their house. Another owner took someone's dog for a walk and helped feed them and stuff like that. And in the immediate recovery, besides food and water, there was a donations page set up and we helped board up their houses so that they wouldn't be affected by the elements. Anyway, these aren't a micro disaster like that that's really affecting an individual or even a community. These, what some might think are small things, they're not big ideas or even moonshots. They're small and inexpensive, but they actually are so important. And I think that can be extrapolated a bit for some of these more existential crises and larger disasters, where that social cohesion, knowing your neighbor, is honestly one of the best things an individual can do today. And so for an area like Smith Island, they do have that. And so how do they use that to their advantage, whether it be a strong community plan, taking mitigation measures while they can, and then really talking about some of the tough decisions that may need to be made in the future, given the future conditions of areas like that.
So I guess my last question is, we've seen quite an evolution in emergency management as we've seen the climate change, as we've seen disasters become more rampant. Are you surprised by the evolution of the preparation?
Part of it surprises me and part of it doesn't. The part that doesn't surprise me is that emergency management has always been this coordination and collaboration function where we recognize that a lot of the problems we have in society or projects that government undertakes necessitate a multidisciplinary solution. And someone's got to be the coordinator of that. And what emergency management has done well is use those core skill sets of project management, problem solving, writing, facilitating group meetings, resource management. At a tactical level, that might be moving first response equipment from here to there. But at a more strategic level, it's that we're really good at understanding conditions and working with others to effectuate change and problem solving. So that doesn't surprise me. And that's why things like an Office of Resilience or any of these tricky problems that do require that multidisciplinary approach are good for emergency management to not only be in the room, but to help effectuate. I think what does surprise me is that the federal government has had a lead role in preparedness and emergency management over the years. Many emergency management offices are primarily or significantly funded by federal grants. What surprised me is that states and local governments need to continue to evolve, to take a more leadership role in that by developing programs at the state and local level, not just solely funded by the federal government, but that are really built ground up rather than top down. In Maryland, we are fortunate to have taken this approach recently by, one, developing the Office of Resilience at the state level, but two, through legislation, we also have a state disaster relief fund that is funded by and administered by the state instead of FEMA. We'll still use the FEMA national program. That's going to be incredibly important. But for these micro disasters that really do harm people, we needed a way to really help disaster survivors, even on small scale disasters, not the big hurricanes, not only the big fires and things like that, but these other smaller community-based incidents. And so I'm really excited about that. And I do think that's the direction of emergency management. How do we build local and state programs that fully complement what we already have at the federal level through these larger grants and, again, larger disasters?
Chas Eby, thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me on.
Public Health on Call is a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, produced by Joshua Sharfstein, Lindsay Smith-Rogers, and Stephanie Desmon. Audio production by J.B. Arbogast, Holly Cardinale, Philip Porter, Spencer Greer, and Matthew Martin, with support from Chip Hickey. Distribution by Nick Moran. Production support from Catherine Ricardo. Social media run by Grace Fernandez and Shian Briscoe. If you have questions or ideas for us, please send an email to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes. Thank you for listening.